Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Fandoms Assemble. We're breaking down content from all your favorite fandoms, from the Marvel Universe to Harry Potter and the wider Wizarding World, Disney, Pixar, Star Wars, Game of Thrones, and really whatever else this golden age of IP decides to throw at us next. As always, my name's Steve Oborn Jr., and I am your host as we continue on this journey through the magic of modern-day media. I'd like to take a moment to thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending a portion of your day with me, and I hope you find this pod to be both entertaining and informative, but most importantly, a satisfying resource for all those who love to think way too hard about our favorite movies, books, and television shows. If you're like me, you run to the Reddit boards and Twitter feeds after that latest episode drops, and you're already Googling Easter eggs on the ride home from the movie theater. I'm here to tell you that that's okay. There are others of us out there, and I hope that Fandoms Assemble can be the arena where all that beautiful obsession can live and grow. Let's get to it. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to the summer of Loki. I greatly apologize for the hiatus between Falcon and the Winter Soldier and Loki. I know I said that we were going to be having a WandaVision rewatch. I promise, folks, that will still be coming, and that season will drop all at once sometime this summer. We're going to work through Loki in the live episodes. We're going to be doing Black Widow. We're going to be doing a lot of things this summer. But I promise, before the summer ends, WandaVision will be coming to a podcast channel near you. That being said, we are starting with Loki, episode 1 in this episode of Fandoms Assemble. And before we get into the details of this episode, what do we know this Loki show is supposed to be about? Loki died at the beginning of Infinity War. Sorry for anyone who hasn't gotten through the MCU yet. Spoiler alert. Loki dies at the hands of Thanos at the beginning of Infinity War. But we know in Endgame that Loki, a different version, different reality of Loki, escapes via the Tesseract during the time heist. And that is where we pick up at the beginning of this episode. So after they give us a quick recap of what I just spoke to, we start and open in the Gobi Desert in Mongolia with Loki crashing Earth. So after Loki's arrested after the Battle of New York in 2012, we see the Avengers intersect with that timeline via the time heist. Tony Stark is escaping with the stolen Tesseract so they can get the Infinity Stone out of it. When 2012 Hulk kicks it out of his hands, Loki picks it up and disappears. Now, unlike the Red Skull at the end of Captain America: The First Avenger, Loki is a god. He is able to handle the Tesseract in his hand, and he gets transported to the Gobi Desert. He escapes custody, but he doesn't get anywhere useful for him. And much in the mindset of 2012 Loki, where he's trying to conquer Midgard, he starts speaking to these citizens of the Gobi Desert, little hovel here, and goes into his ruler speech here about he's going to free them from the bondage of the idea of freedom. But they have no idea what he's saying, and before he could start to explain to them, we see the TVA time door open, and they step out and grab the Tesseract. Loki confronts them, and they say, Loki Laufeyson, you're under arrest for a sequence violation for crimes against the sacred timeline. They hit him with the baton that makes him move at 1/16th speed. They throw the speed collar on him, and we can see right away that the TVA is not something to be messed with. These guys, we haven't seen them before. We haven't really interacted with anyone responsible for managing time other than Doctor Strange with the Time Stone. But it's clear that B-15 and her other Minutemen mean business, and they have extreme power to alter the state of reality around Loki. And with the time collar on, they throw cuffs on him, they walk him through the door, and then they set a reset charge, which will essentially reset this area. Everyone in this little Gobi Desert town will be deleted. And for now, at least, the sacred timeline will be restored. So now Loki steps into the TVA headquarters, where he comes in contact with this local douche who's talking about how his father works at Goldman Sachs. Well, local douche for me. If you went to school in the Northeast, you know a kid like this. And B-15 comes, she throws the Tesseract on Casey, the secretary, for lack of a better word's desk. Loki is shocked. He's scared, quite frankly, that she's just throwing around this immense power so willy-nilly. And then he's shuffled off for processing. And as he's getting processed, we get a series of rooms where he's dropping through the floor. The first one starts with a robot clothes change. They laser off his Asgardian wear and put him in TVA prisoner jumpsuit. After that, he goes through and he needs to sign off on a transcript of every word he's ever said. And as he's speaking more to the clerk behind the desk, more sheets of paper are printing out. And for a guy who's supposed to be a silver-tongued, the god of mischief, who never shuts up, frankly, in the MCU, I am shocked at how small that stack of papers is. He drops through the floor again, and he goes through a scan to see if he's a robot. We get a comical scene where he's like, wait, do people not know if they're robots? What if I'm a robot? What happens? The guy says, well, if you're a robot, you're going to melt from the inside out. Scares him very much, but he goes through. Obviously, he's a frost giant. He's not a robot, so we're clear there. Then he drops through one more time, and we get the waiting room for the TVA court. He walks in. The guy watching the door says, take a ticket, please, and get in line. And it's Loki and this little douche Goldman Sachs legacy standing there waiting to be tried by the time court of the TVA. While they're waiting, we get my favorite scene from the episode. Miss Minutes comes on the television in a very cool 80s, 90s cartoon Schoolhouse Rock vibe. A welcome message gets posted about why you're in the TVA, what the TVA does, and why you're being tried for your crime against the quote-unquote sacred timeline. So real quick here, I'll give you a summary of what that video said. Essentially, the TVA, the Time Variance Authority, was set up by these three legendary timekeepers after a multiversal war. So we know Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness is coming. We've touched on the multiverse in WandaVision. We know that Spider-Man Far From Home is going to touch on the multiverse. Quantum Mania, the Ant-Man movie, will also be touching on the multiverse. This is what we're gearing up for in Phase 4. So, a multiversal war has already occurred. There are branches that have occurred off of the quote-unquote sacred timeline in the past, and when those come back together and crash back into each other, wars occur. So these timekeepers converged and controlled all of the branch timelines out there and created the sacred timeline. And the TVA exists to capture variants that break off that sacred timeline and create what they refer to as nexus events. A nexus event is a permanent break from the sacred timeline, creating a new timeline, which again creates the multiverse, could possibly create a war. So the TVA goes out, they find these variants before their timeline becomes permanent, and they delete them. They reset them, or they prune them, they call it. And that in turn avoids the recreation of the multiverse. After the video ends, we saw that the Goldman Sachs kid refused to take a ticket. He gets quote unquote reset, aka hit with that little laser baton and completely eradicated from the face of the earth. The credit then runs, the little creepy, cop thriller, Stranger Things-esque almost Loki title flashes across the screen with the letters changing like we've seen the whole time, almost like a ransom letter-ish spelling out of the name Loki, and we cut back inside the courtroom. Actually, no. Before we get inside the courtroom, we flash to Axion Province, France, 1549, where we see Owen Wilson, a.k.a. Agent Mobius, with his Minutemen inspecting an attack site, the sixth attack this week that a rogue variant has gone and killed Minutemen. At each of the now 7 attack sites, they kill the Minutemen without warning, they sneak in, they kill them all, they stab them, and then they steal their time charge and disappear again. So is this variant, who at the end of the episode, yes, we find out to be a different version of Loki, trying to recreate the multiverse, trying to create a multiversal war? That's still up in the air. What's different about this case, unlike the other ones, is that this version of Loki, this rogue variant, came across a child inside this church in 1549 provincial France. Mobius sees the child, and while the other Minutemen go to attack him, Mobius says, hey, listen, let's talk to this kid. He breaks out his phone and he draws a little picture and shows it animated. Now, I'll just say, Loki also gives this kid a pack of candy between, this is a running joke on the internet, but between the smartphone and the candy from 2050, this kid from provincial France, 1549, would have an absolute stroke if they really came across this. This type of technology is not even a glimmer of existing. Electricity hasn't even been invented yet. And this kid just lets all this technology roll right off his back. Ignoring that Very unrealistic interaction, however. Mobius then asks the kid, did he see who did this? To which the kid turns and he points at a stained glass window depicting the devil. Okay, now I'm sure all of you will agree if you have TikTok downloaded on your phone. When this came across the screen at 3 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, your phones absolutely burst into flames with the amount of people running online and saying, oh my God, we were right. Mephisto is coming to the MCU. Look, there's the devil himself. But we know by the end of the episode that they're saying that this is Loki. And when you look at the stained glass window, the horns, Loki's helm has horns on it. He's also known to be the silver-tongued manipulator, like the snake in the Garden of Eden. So we'll put a pin in it. I still think that there's a slight possibility that they might be melding the two characters, and if Loki will live on in the MCU moving forward, it might be a recreation into a version of Mephisto. I don't know. We'll see. The kid then shows Mobius the kablooey gum, which again should have just made his heart explode the second he put it in his mouth. And before he can inspect it further, a clerk from the TVA comes through a time door, tells Mobius that, hey, you need to check this out, and he hands him our Loki's file, showing that he's been arrested and he's about to be put before the time court of the TVA. So now we get to TVA court, and when we walk in, when Loki walks in the room, we see murals of the TVA and the timekeepers on the wall. And if you look in the first panel on Loki's right, I really like that they gave a little homage to a young Stan Lee. But then we start, and Loki's before the judge. They call him Loki Laufeyson, which I guess is technically right, but he should be called Loki Odinson. I mean, if the dude was going to have a license, he didn't legally change his name to Laufeyson, so I'm not sure why the TVA is referring to him as such. But he is listed as variant L1130, who is charged with a sequence violation 72089 for crimes against the sacred timeline. And right away, Loki does not disappoint. He goes into the silver tongue manipulator. He tries to charm his way out of everything, and he does so with this judge up there by saying he's not guilty. Listen, if you want to talk about people manipulating the timeline, I saw and smelled a second Tony Stark, which is how I even got the Tesseract in the first place. The Avengers are time traveling. If you want someone guilty of violating time, go check out the Avengers. Judge says, we're not here to talk about the Avengers. We know the Avengers, and the time traveling they did has essentially been blessed by the timekeepers. The timekeepers said that that was supposed to happen, which right away quells any concerns that people had over, well, hey, Loki grabbed the Tesseract once. Steve was using these time stones. The Avengers used these time stones to change the course of the world and defeat Thanos. And then Steve wasn't arrested as he went back and returned the Infinity Stones to all their timelines. What the heck? Well, here's your answer. The timekeepers are aware that that happened, and they bless that, and that is part of the sacred timeline. There are crazy shit that happens all over the MCU. We're going to eventually see the creation of X-Men, the Fantastic Four, all these interstellar events and things that we've been watching on the quote-unquote sacred timeline, a.k.a. the Marvel Cinematic Universe is the sacred timeline, and away we go. When trying to blame the Avengers and sweet-talk his way out of this doesn't work, Loki throws his hands out and tries to use his magic. But magic doesn't work in the TVA. He's then found guilty without really any other questions. What crimes he committed? I don't know. None really against the TVA. I mean, he picked up the Tesseract when it fell at his feet. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's a crime warranting being deleted from the Earth. It's not like he was yet trying to manipulate the powers of the Tesseract to change time and space, and therefore he needed to be arrested and deleted before he ruined the timeline any further. Nonetheless, he's found guilty, and when Loki challenges and says that you bunch of bureaucrats aren't going to tell me how my story ends, the judge says, listen, it's not your story. It never has been. Before he can go get batoned, just like the kid from New York, Mobius steps up with the file and says, hey, I know what he's capable of. I think he could be of use to the TVA. Let's not delete him just yet. He goes up, and it's clear that he's got a relationship with this judge. And she lets him off and releases him to Agent Mobius's custody. Outside the courtroom, Mobius is showing Loki around, and he takes him to a window where he could see all of the TVA. And I guess when you're outside of time, and therefore you have an unlimited amount of time to benefit from all the technology that ever has and ever will exist. When you look at the TVA, it looks like a mashup of Asgard, Wakanda, the World War Hulk planet where Hulk and Thor were being held captive. And it's beautiful. And it amazes Loki. And he says, hey, I thought that magic wasn't allowed here, but it's not magic. It's just all the power that the human race has ever and ever will compile has turned into creating this magnificent city outside of time where everything flows and they oversee the sacred timeline. Loki then asks Mobius, so how long have you been here? And he says, well, listen, you'll get used to it, but time passes differently at the TVA. Mobius then says he and everyone else here, as well as this building, this world, was created by the Timekeepers for the sole purpose of managing the timeline and making sure that variants don't create another multiversal war. He then takes Loki into the Time Theater, where he explains to him that, listen, everything is already written. The future hasn't fully been written yet. We'll get into that later. But everything in the past and the present has already been written, and it's just their job to steer everyone to that predetermined path. Now, Loki obviously doesn't like this. As a man who seeks power, he wants to be in charge of his own fate. He believes in the power of free will, and he denies that his fate is already predetermined. Mobius then shows him, quote-unquote, his greatest hits in the Time Theater on this little projector, and for the time being, all he sees is what had just immediately happened to him in New York when he came to Midgard, aka Earth, and he tried to enslave the people at the show, and then the whole Battle of New York that occurred afterwards, the Avengers circling up in their famous pose from Avengers 1, and then the therapy session starts, and we'll just touch on a quick few points here. The time collar that Loki has on will be used many times throughout the rest of this episode, where basically they take a little remote and they could move you to any part of recent time. So if Loki starts to charge at Mobius, he rewinds it and Loki gets thrown back into his chair. There's a lot of that, so again, I'm not going to bring it up every time it happens. But then Loki's trying to say how powerful and mischievous he is and what an amazing all-powerful god. And Mobius right away shuts him down and says, hey, listen, I'm not looking for you. I already have you in custody. You're a pussycat. And, he's looking for big bads, particularly dangerous variants. And in order to capture the particularly dangerous variant that they're looking for, who again we'll find out will be an alternate reality Loki, he's trying to pick Loki's brain about what his true motivations are. So listen, if you had succeeded at the Battle of New York, what is your goal? Loki says, well, he wants to be the king of Midgard. That's his superficial plan. He wants to be the all-powerful ruler of the human race, and he wants to dissolve them of their delusions that freedom is a real thing, that the power of choice they had is only holding the human race back, and as the all-powerful ruler of Midgard, he will free them of all their worries. Mobius then shows Loki some of his other particularly cruel scenes, stabs Agent Coulson through the back, and for some reason doesn't tell Loki he actually lived. For that, see Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. But then he starts talking about how you're the god of mischief, but you're not particularly mischievous. It just looks like you're going out and hurting people. And the therapy continues, and Mobius keeps digging and digging, and Loki keeps denying and denying that he's not exactly who he thinks he is. And then Mobius shows him Frigga's death, Thor and Loki's mother's death, and how it was all his fault. Loki's shook because he's never lived this reality before. He was taken out of that timeline before this occurred, before he could go serve his sentence in Asgard following the Battle of New York. And then we end this interaction with something I didn't really like, where Mobius basically says, he puts up a picture again of the Avengers in their formation, and he says, essentially Loki was a stepping stone to the Avengers becoming who they needed to be, for the all-powerful protectors of Earth to grow and develop and become the heroes that the sacred timeline needed. And I don't like that, because that throws away a lot of the character development that Loki experiences in the MCU. He's not just a stepping stone. He's not all bad. I mean, we see in his interactions with Thor, and it's happened, Thor mentions it's happened throughout their whole childhood, that he would turn into a snake because Thor loves snakes, and then he'd go and he'd stab him. And that was kind of the thing. Like, he always wanted to be Thor's brother. He really loves Thor. He really wants to be a good guy at times, but then his own character flaws make him snap back and ruin whatever good he's got going on, and he turns back into a villain. And that's really the story of Loki in the MCU. It's not that he was an all-powerful villain. He's a very misunderstood villain who provides the foil at most times, but when it really counted, in Infinity War, he tries to take out Thanos and he dies trying. And that Loki, the Loki we're going to get in this show, who's going to be chasing after evil variant Loki, is the true hero that we know is somewhere deep, deep inside there. But before the therapy session can continue, B-15, the Minuteman, comes in and pulls Mobius outside and says, hey, we lost another unit. Evil Loki has struck again, and they needed to go figure out what happened, and they need to go investigate and correct that timeline again before the multiverse is created. When he's done talking to B-15, Mobius comes back inside. Loki's gone, and in their brief interaction, Loki had pickpocketed the remote out of there, so he can't even whoosh him back in with the time remote. And then as they chase after him, Mobius gives two references to, hey, no pruning, no resetting. The Minutemen have two words for viciously killing somebody. I don't understand. These guys are created by the Timekeepers, so at least in the Timekeepers' eyes, they're infallible. But these guys really love to kill. They just blow up anything. When they go and correct a timeline, they're setting down charges. And I feel like if Marvel wants to, they can really warp the powers of the TVA. If someone within the TVA turns bad, they could really wield a lot of power here that could cause a whole lot of damage. But as the Minutemen run out after Loki, we see him out front with Casey the secretary, and he says, listen, give me the Tesseract or I'll gut you like a fish. And it's kind of the first instance we see that, oh yeah, these guys are created by the TVA. Some of them, unless they go out in the world like Mobius and investigate crimes, they don't know anything other than the four walls that they're in. So he has no idea what a fish is. He then says, listen, I'll give you the Tesseract. That's fine. He opens up his drawer and Loki sees the Tesseract. He sees the Infinity Stones. He sees war medals. I noticed something that looked like almost a Dracula vampire medallion, poker chips, daggers, and generally other ancient artifacts. And when he's seeing this, and the Infinity Stones are deactivated, and these all-powerful relics are just left as paperweights for this doofus Casey at his desk, Loki the light goes off in his head, and he looks around in amazement, and he's like, is this shitty little office really the greatest power in the universe? Why, yes, it indeed is. As far as we know, in the MCU at least. And B-15 finally catches up to Loki. They get some hand-to-hand fighting in, where Loki slaps the time collar on her and then goes back to the time theater, zooms her back and forth, and then eventually gets her to disappear. And while he's in the time theater alone, he goes back to the little projector they got there, and he's looking at Frigga's death. And then he goes forward a little more, and he sees Odin's death. He sees the Hela fight, and eventually he sees his own death post-Ragnarok fighting Thanos. And he scoffs to himself about, what a glorious purpose I serve on the earth. According to the Timekeepers, according to this sacred timeline, this all-powerful place I find myself in, I'm supposed to die in the not-too-near future, and without doing anything extravagant. Now, while obviously seeing your life flash before your eyes and it ending in an unceremonious death is shocking to Loki, it really hit me hard too, because then the tape rolls out and it says, end of file. And that means that in the sacred timeline, in the main story at least, Loki is not going to be around. It kind of signaled to me that unless something changes in the future, I guess the Timekeepers could always go in and add more reel to the film. He's not coming back after this television series. He's going to wind up either staying at the TVA out of time and therefore doesn't have an official sacred timeline story, or eventually he's going to get reset. We're going to get that big sad moment where Mobius has to kill Loki in order to restore the multiverse. Mobius then comes in, and this is post-therapy breakthrough for Loki. He starts really talking to Mobius about what motivates him. And he hurts people because he knows inside that he's weak. And he's the master of illusion, and he needs to create that illusion of power. What better way to gain power for him than to elicit fear in the people he's trying to rule over? And with that, with Loki looking to truly show him who he is, what motivates him, to provide Mobius with that very helpful piece of insight, Mobius lets him know what the deal is. Listen, we're not just chasing some random variant. We're chasing you from a different timeline. We're chasing you, Loki, a more powerful Loki, and we need your help. We need to know which way your mind thinks to find him in time, not before a deadline's reached, but literally in time. He could be not only anywhere, but at any time in the history of the recorded Earth, everything that has and ever will happen. So it's really a needle in a haystack unless you can understand how Loki's mind works and the most frequent places he might try to hide out in that timeline. With that revelation now uncovered, with Loki now on board and helping the TVA, we get a shot at evil variant Loki, I guess I'll refer to them as for now, in Salina, Oklahoma in 1858, and we see the Minutemen reporting and finding a shovel-like weapon from the third millennia, i.e. the year 3000 and beyond. So not only has this Loki gone back to provincial France in the 1500s, not only are they attacking people in more recent history, but they've gone as far as the third millennia to collect weapons, and the TVA is chasing them across 3,000 years. Now, at first, they're just reporting to the variant in the weapon showing up in a place in 1858 where it shouldn't be. But then they're quickly ambushed and provided a fiery death by a hooded figure who we obviously now know is Loki. There's oil on the ground, and the Minutemen just assume, oh, well, I guess they used this shovel to strike oil. Someone from the future, they're coming back to a time where oil was more plentiful to make a quick buck. But no, the oil was placed on the ground to kill the Minutemen and to steal their time charge in a furtherance of this evil variant Loki's plan. But that'll do it for this episode recap of Loki Season 1, Episode 1. It's really great to be back in front of the mic, and this is such a fun show to be covering. I'm really excited to see where it goes from here. But, as always, Fandoms Assemble strives to be the #1 resource on the internet for all those who love to think way too hard about our favorite movies, books, and television shows. To honor that promise, we can't just give you the same old boring episode breakdown. We got to give you some analysis. We got to give you some things to think about. So to honor that promise, here are the top 5 questions we had from Loki, Episode 1. Question number 1, and this is really a challenge to this show and this premise in general, but why was the MCU timeline blessed? There were so many fucked up things that happened in the MCU. Thanos snapping half the universe away, A-okay. But Loki picking up the Tesseract and going and hiding in the Gobi Desert, that was warranting blowing him up, erasing him from the face of the earth, hit him with the fucking lightning stick, and quote-unquote reset or prune him, to borrow a coin of phrase from the TVA. That just makes absolutely no sense. There were so many things that were wrong in the MCU, and for the timekeepers to say that that's what's keeping the world on the right path, for the 2 timelines to converge between, 2012 to 2014, Thanos showing back up in 2025 New York, like, I don't know. I don't get it. It's a stretch here. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not a timekeeper, but I guess when we finally meet them and we find out how they make decisions and what kind of people, what kind of beings these are, we'll have a better understanding about why they let so much shit go on in the MCU. Question number 2, and I brought this up in the episode recap, is Loki and Mephisto going to be a blend? Are they going to take the tact not to actually put the devil into the MCU and fucking erupt a volcano of backlash online for depicting the devil and ruining the innocence of the children of the world? I could see Marvel going this direction where, listen, hey, we got a bad guy with horns already. Let's meld the two together, kind of blend Loki and Mephisto's magic together and go from there. That also begs the question, Loki is currently out of time. This variant is currently out of time. Time being, with a capital T. How much influence did this situation have over the events of WandaVision? Was there really a Mephisto big bad in there, and it just happened to be Loki? I guess we'll figure that out as we move through and see how the series ends, to see where Loki and Mobius and the TVA wind up in the MCU timeline when this show ends, and really how all these pieces fall out. Question number 3, and I question what Loki really did wrong in this situation. But this question is geared towards, what the hell could that Goldman Sachs legacy have done that wound him up in front of the TVA and eventually resulted in the fact simply that he didn't take the deli ticket from the front, for him to be erased from the timeline, for him to be completely eradicated from the face of the earth without a trial? I mean, he doesn't have magic. What could happen? How could variance occur without superpowers or magic, or, the other ways, obviously, that Lokis across the ages have found themselves in front of the TVA? What could this kid have done? Did he just show up late to work one day, and therefore they were like, oh, nope, you're going to ruin the course of humanity. You're going to break the sacred timeline because you hit that snooze button one more time. And they just plucked him out of his current reality and then eventually killed him for it. I don't know. It's pretty crazy. Question number 4, and this easily could have been number 5 leading into a Fandom Academy, but this is going to be one of the biggest questions that this show lends itself to as we continue on here. Does this therefore make the Infinity Saga, the last 20 years of the MCU, null and void? We see the Infinity Stones laying in a box, laying in a desk side drawer of Casey, the biggest doofus in the world, at the TVA. Does this mean Tony Stark died for nothing? Does this mean that Steve Rogers went into the ice for nothing, that he went through all that pain and hardship? Bucky, Sam, fucking Nat dying. I mean, come on. Does this really just make that all worthless? I mean, I guess not, because the TVA's job is to maintain the sacred timeline. And on the sacred timeline, the Infinity Stones mean everything. All these sacrifices mean everything to the continuance of the sacred timeline. But when you pull out and you look at it from Loki's perspective and you look at it from the TVA, they're dealing with something that may just seem like a trivial side mission. But at the end of the day, that's them chasing down this evil variant Loki apparently has significantly more impact on the history of reality than did the Avengers fighting Thanos, collecting the Infinity Stones, the snap, the blip, all of it. And frankly, it's disheartening to see something that was so revered, that was so feared in the MCU, just be sitting there worthless, disarmed, deactivated in a desk side drawer. Especially when you look at it in the lens and you put yourself in the theater, watching the end of Infinity War as our favorite characters fade away because of the power that lays in this desk side drawer. It's honestly crazy to think about. And question number 5 in our Fandom Academy for this first episode of Fandoms Assemble's coverage of Loki. Who is the Time Variance Authority, aka the TVA, and what else have they influenced? Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, as you know, Fandoms Assemble strives to be the number one resource on the internet for all those who love to think way too hard about our favorite movies, books, and television shows. To honor that promise, we can't just raise life's great questions, we gotta answer a few of them ourselves. So sharpen your pencils, crack open your textbooks, please try and not commit any sequence violations while you're here, and join me for this episode's Fandom Academy on the Time Variance Authority. So in short, the Time Variance Authority is a fictional organization, a group of timeline monitors who appear in the Marvel comic books to, as they said in Loki, protect the sacred timeline. We first see the TVA in 1986's Thor number 372. Created by Walt Simonson and Sal Buscema, the TVA, like most characters, events, places, organizations in the MCU, started as a playful nod for the writers to honor something that was going on either in the real world or someone on the staff. So the TVA was originally meant to honor longtime Marvel writer, editor, and most importantly, continuity expert Mark Grunwald, who, much like the TVA, who makes sure that the continuity is protected in the sacred timeline. Mark Grunwald's job at Marvel Comics was to make sure that in all these wide-spanning extensions of the Marvel Universe, all these properties, all these franchises, all these different heroes, that the sacred timeline of Marvel Comics was continuous. Also funny to note, when the original illustrations came out, the TVA members all looked like Mark. But to stick to their role in the Marvel Comics, the TVA is an infinitely vast bureaucracy that governs a significant number of realities in the ever-growing multiverse. And their job, in essence, is to keep track of every reality that has ever, is ever, or will ever exist, very similar to their role in the MCU in Loki. Actually, what seems to be contradictory with the way Loki is handling the TVA and their creation, if you go through the Missed Minutes video, it seems like at the beginning of time, the TVA was created by the Timekeepers to right wrongs and to make sure that the sacred timeline stayed on track. At times, it variated and multiversal wars occurred, but in the comics, that's not true. The TVA is actually created a long time in the future, and they go back to deal with the wrongs that have occurred in the timeline and to maintain what's already been written on that one string of the sacred timeline. Since 1986, the TVA have run into the likes of Kang the Conqueror and his Kang Dynasty, a villain that will be central in Ant-Man 3, as well as Elioth, the Revelation, the Congress of Realities, and other like organizations who feel that they should be monitoring how time exists. In terms of future crossovers with the MCU, the TVA comes into play in the She-Hulk comics, when an agent of the TVA attempts to warn Clinton Barton, aka Hawkeye, on an attempt on his life. She-Hulk, Hawkeye, two shows that we know are coming up on Disney Plus within the next year to 2 years. And while limited, the TVA also has run-ins with the X-Men, albeit on Earth 13729 in the comics. The TVA exists in the comics in what is known as the Null timeline, i.e., they are out of time, as I described in the episode breakdown. And before I go into this further, I'd just like to touch on a question I had about how the Timekeepers and the TVA interact with things like, or people like Doctor Strange, the Time Stone, the Sanctums, and the Guardians of Reality on Midgard, Earth, whatever you want to refer to it as. I feel like someone should have been interacting with the Timekeepers with Mobius before this, and I wonder if throughout these next few episodes we might see a Doc Strange introduction, or at least have someone at the TVA reference that not everyone who's ever dealt with the TVA has had their minds wiped. I mentioned Hawkeye, I mentioned She-Hulk. The TVA also has run-ins with the Fantastic Four in the comics. We know the Fantastic Four are coming. They've also run into Deadpool, who is now back at being a Disney property outside the hands of Sony, and who will, according to Kevin Feige, officially be in the canon MCU. But to save you the pain of me going through the very convoluted stories, when you get involved with time travel in anything, as in Endgame, that shit really made no sense. Back to the Future, I mean, they reference them all in Endgame. All the time travel stories all have different ways of doing things. They all get past, present, and future versions of themselves intertwined, and chaos erupts. And for me to explain that in this, 5-minute segment on the Fandom Academy today would just be painful to listen to. So I'll just leave it at many characters that we're going to see that have future properties coming up are the properties that are involved with the TVA in the comics. This was not a mistake. This was not done by accident that they decided to introduce the TVA at times where other tangential stories are also being introduced to the MCU. Last but not least, the one character that is central to this storyline is the one that we just left in WandaVision, Wanda Maximoff. As I said, Kang the Conqueror, Kang the Time Conqueror, will be introduced in Ant-Man Quantumania, and him and Wanda don't fuck with each other in the comics. They have had many run-ins focused around Billy and Tommy that we saw in WandaVision. And here, too, I don't think it's any accident that we're getting introduced to the full powers of the Scarlet Witch, the Timekeepers, the TVA, and eventually Kang the Conqueror by the end of Phase 4 in Ant-Man Quantumania. This is going to be exciting. Like I said, time stuff gets convoluted and it gets complicated, but time stuff always provides great content, many possibilities to bring people in and out of situations that they were in previously, to reintroduce Loki to the MCU. We saw in previews, I'm not going to touch on it right now, but we saw in previews what looked like Natasha on Vormir sitting next to Loki. Could Nat possibly come back into the MCU? Could Black Widow be her reintroduction? I don't know. We got to wait a couple weeks for that to come out. It's great. It provides great content for us to talk about. It provides an endless number of theories about what could happen, about how they could tie in other characters from other realms, other areas, other properties we've never seen before. And I'm really excited that the TVA has been formally introduced into the MCU. But that'll do it for this episode's Fandom Academy. I hope you found that segment to be both entertaining and informative. Here's some rapid-fire Easter eggs that you might have missed. Number 1. We see a robot roaming around at the beginning of the episode in the TVA, which looks extremely like Herbie from the Fantastic Four. Whether it was WandaVision, whether it was the couple leaks we got in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, whether it's just the fact that we know the fucking Fantastic Four are coming and they won't just give us that payoff yet. Seeing a robot from the animated Fantastic Four was really cool to see at the TVA. Number 2, in the missed minutes, we see in that cartoon, the introduction to the TVA, a war going on and the TVA being involved that appears to happen between the Kree and what could possibly be the Nova Corps. We hear in Guardians of the Galaxy, Ronan talk about how the Kree and the Nova Corps were involved in a war for 1,000 years. Could that potentially be something that the TVA was involved in? Personally, I also think if you're looking at this, if you go back and look at a photo online, it looks like the Kree are on the left, the TVA's in the middle, and then what could possibly be the Nova Corps on a fight on Titan are over to the right. But they're also holding shields and spears, and their helmets kind of look cat-like. So I wonder if that could also be like Wakanda's venture into a space war. Is that something that could potentially be coming to the MCU? And this was in fact a flash forward as opposed to a flashback. I also heard rumblings that they've cast a Namor, who Namor, if you don't know, was one of the original superheroes in the Marvel Comics. It was the Human Torch and Namor the Submariner. Namor and his kingdom had a very large war against Wakanda. Could this possibly be tied in too? These folks are blue. They don't necessarily need to be Kree. They could be fins on top of their heads and be somehow Namor and his Submariners in his kingdom of Atlantis fighting against Wakanda in space. I don't know. This is a very interesting picture, though, and it's something that definitely drew my attention when we went through the episode. Easter egg number 3. Loki and Mobius and their banter back and forth as he's being shown around mentioned the Nightmare Department. Now, Nightmare, we know Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. This is the film property that all of this multiverse stuff is leading up to. Nightmare is one of the primary villains in the Doctor Strange comic book runs. Number 4, one thing I noticed that I had to look up, honestly, being a child of the early 90s, I don't know how I didn't run across this before, but Josta was an energy drink produced by the Pepsi Corporation in the 1990s, and it seems to be Mobius's drink of choice. And then lastly, the DB Cooper cutaway was very amusing to see that they have retconned Loki as the DB Cooper legend. DB Cooper being a thief in 1971 that had hijacked a Boeing 727 and stolen $200,000 only to escape from the plane. By the time it landed, the police surrounded the plane, and DB Cooper had apparently parachuted out of the plane with the cash without the police knowing and had ultimately escaped with his crime. One of the all-time great heists. And it was great to see that with something that has eluded law enforcement for all time of how DB Cooper could have escaped. The fact that it was Loki being picked up by Heimdall and the Bifrost, and that's how he got out of there with the cash. Really like to see that story in more detail and what bet he could have lost to his brother and in what context does that occur. That would be great to see in a future Thor movie. But that'll do it for this episode's Rapid Fire Easter eggs that you might have missed. That's right, folks. It's tinfoil hat time. Everyone's favorite segment where I take a few minutes to go into my crazy ass theories, about how the property we're watching, in this case Loki, is going to shape out and how it's going to affect the larger MCU. So for the next few minutes, please indulge me as I give you my theories about what I think we're going to see here in episodes 2 through 6 of Marvel Studios' Loki. All right, so it's really early here. We only got 56 minutes of television to go off of, but I think it's enough that I'm going to venture into the waters of coming up with a theory on how I think this is going to shape out. So we have a rogue Loki going through time that's made apparent by the end of the episode. And I think that this Loki is attempting to recreate the multiverse and start a war in order to prevent Ragnarok. We know from Agent Mobius's prodding of Loki in this episode that he's trying to get an understanding of who Loki is as a person to understand Loki's movements and his motivations. Well, if there's one thing we know about Loki is that he's not all bad. When the chips are down, he truly cares for his brother. He truly loved his father. He, of course, was very attached to his mother, who he's now seen die on screen. And we don't know how those events have differed in this rogue variant Loki's timeline. Thor, Loki, willingly accepted Ragnarok in the sacred timeline in order to kill Hela. Well, in an instance where Hela doesn't show up, where Hela doesn't exist, or that Loki or Thor happens to be the stronger sibling and Hela isn't a threat, you still have Surtur coming to Asgard trying to enact Ragnarok. You then have this evil variant Loki going around and stealing all these time charges and killing the Minutemen. For what purpose? What could you need a time charge for? Well, as we saw in the sacred timeline in the MCU and Thor Ragnarok, Surtur is fucking huge. So in order to conquer him, especially if it's left up to this Loki to do so, you would kind of need a time charge, something that would just wipe everything in its path out of existence. Secondly, obviously this is leading up to Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. It's made apparent, to me at least, I proffered in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, we weren't sure who the big bad in Phase 4 was going to be, but there's no reason for the near future why I don't see it as evil Loki. He was the big bad in Avengers. Obviously, there was a secret big bad in Thanos that was directing Loki's actions in that movie. And I definitely could see that being a Kang who's highly invested in time travel. I could see that being a Galactus who has Fantastic Four tie-ins if we bring them in. There are numerous opportunities for larger villains to come out, but I think the primary foil, unless of course they're taken care of by the end of this series, is going to be this different variation of Loki, and that's how he's going to insert himself back into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, aka the Sacred Timeline. And then last but not least, and I don't really want to get into it right now, but fuck it, for social media content, I'll throw this out there. Again, that I think Loki and Mephisto's characters are going to be melded in a PC safe way to bring the devil into the MCU. And that in some way, shape, or form, Loki, aka Mephisto, will have been pulling the strings behind Agatha all along. And we'll see maybe at some point the TVA find its way to Westview, New Jersey to deal with the mess created by Wanda Maximoff and her ex. And that's all I got, guys. This has been a great episode. Really happy to get behind the mic talking about live shows where we really get to delve into the future possibilities. We get to start to talk about the crazy theories that might erupt and really see who's right. We get to meld together the brightest minds on the internet when it comes to Marvel superhero culture. And we get to see how, really the most exciting part about this is that we get to see how we would write the show. And we get to see that for 6 days until we get to see how the authors, the writers, the directors of Marvel Studios decided to write this show. And that's probably my favorite part about all this, is sharing the theories with you, is analyzing what we just saw and prospecting. That's the beautiful thing about streaming in 2021, is the engagement that we get on social media, on podcasts like this one, and around the internet as a whole, of people diving into and being consumed with the content that's coming out on a weekly basis. And if you happen to enjoy this content, if you happen to enjoy this podcast, first and foremost, if you're back from Falcon and the Winter Soldier and you're joining me for Loki, thank you very much. I'm really happy to spend this time with you guys, to get back behind the mic for an hour a week and talk about the shows that we all love. And in order to keep doing that, I need you to please, whatever your preferred podcast channel is, go subscribe, rate, and review. For rating and reviewing, you got to head over to Apple Podcasts. If you have an iPhone, you don't need to hit pause. Go to the pre-downloaded podcast app. Go give me that 5-star rating. Give me a few sentences about what you love, what you hate about the show. It'll really help grow the show. It'll help bring new people into the show. If you don't have an iPhone, what the hell is wrong with you? Go find a friend who's making better life choices and borrow their iPhone. Subscribe, rate, and review on their phone on Apple Podcasts, please. Number 2, if you're in search of a friend who owns an iPhone and you think that they would really enjoy the Fandoms Assemble podcast, whether it's our Falcon and the Winter Soldier coverage or this first episode of Loki, it is your obligation to share the Fandoms Assemble podcast with them. That could be a parent, a friend, a family member, a coworker, a neighbor, a dog. Go share the Fandoms Assemble podcast with someone today. Number 3, for more Fandoms Assemble content, for breakdowns of the episode, clips of this episode, news and notes coming from me, as well as some other content that we're going to be coming out with related to other properties. Go follow us at Fandoms Pod, at FANDOMSPOD on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Also, while you got that handle fresh in your mind, please go to patreon.com, patreon.com/FandomsPod, FANDOMSPOD. Patreon is a resource where consumers of content can go and support their favorite content creators. If you want me to be able to post things on time, if you want me to be able to dedicate more time to this show, to provide better breakdowns, more on-time content, delve into more fandoms that we know and love, the primary source of support that a show can get, advertising aside, obviously, and we're still a growing podcast, so we don't have the advertising in place, which I'm sure you're all enjoying as you listen to this podcast. The number one source of support that a show can receive in 2021 is directly from its audience. Please go to patreon.com. If you love the show, please go support the show, patreon.com/fandomspod. Obviously, now that we're in new episodes, number 4, if you are new to the show, welcome. If you're not new to the show, thank you for coming back. But if you're new to the show and you enjoyed this episode, there are 7 more just like it on Falcon and the Winter Soldier. It is a companion podcast, so there will not be spoilers as you're going through it. You can watch episode 1 of Falcon and the Winter Soldier. You can listen to the podcast and go back and forth as you hear my takes and breakdowns and analysis of what we saw with Bucky and Sam in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. That can be found wherever you're listening to this podcast right now. Go out, click on the Fandoms Assemble big link. Go drop back to episodes 1 through 7. This will obviously be episode 8 in your list. And last but not least, please join me next time, which should be posted at the same time. So don't even join me next time. Join me right now. Let this keep rolling in episode 2 of Loki. By the time you're listening to this, episode 2 will be posted as well, and those will both be out before episode 3, I promise. I am intellectually honest about all my takes. I'm going to watch episode 2, and then I am jumping back on the mic, and I am recording episode 2 today. They will be posted at the same time. They'll be posted by Monday of next week before we get episode 3 on Wednesday. Again, I really hope you enjoy the pod. I really hope you all keep listening. Please go subscribe, rate, and review. Follow us on social. Give us that love and support. Head over to patreon.com if you have the resources and like to help grow the show. But most importantly, just keep on listening. Go hit that download button. The way that podcast analytics are tracked, I cannot know you're listening unless you hit that download button. So please go subscribe to the show, download the episodes, and we'll be able to keep creating great content for you. To everyone on the other end of my voice, thank you very much. I love and appreciate all of you. My name's Steve Oborn, host of the Fandoms Assemble podcast, where we will keep breaking down content from all your favorite fandoms from hopefully a very long time. Until next time.